Now that we've talked about how to place nodes and move them inside of the graph view, let's talk about another important window inside of Substance Designer, and that is the Properties window, which can be found right here on the right side docked. The Properties window essentially gives you different categories and parameters that can be set to each individual node or as a whole graph. For example, what I could do is I can double click on any single node and it'll get two different categories. We'll get the base parameters and the specific parameters. The base parameters are different properties that kind of coincide with the properties of the graph as a whole, while the specific parameters coincide for just this single one node. We'll go over the base parameters in a little bit. Right now, I want to focus more so on the actual individual specific parameters for each node. So for this node, we have a couple different options. We can change the color mode of this specific node from an RGB to a grayscale. And because it is a uniform color, we can also sample or choose a different color to make this node. So if we were to make this into an RGB, like we discussed in the previous video, you'll notice that because we're plugging it into certain nodes that want a grayscale input, we'll start getting these kind of broken connections. So if we just change that back to a grayscale. But again, if we wanted to just bring in another uniform color, we can actually just make it a color. It actually auto comes in as a color with uniform colors, and we can actually make it something a little bit more vibrant. And we can actually plug this into the base color. And then because we've plugged it into the base color, these outputs are connected to the 3D view, it auto updates. So one thing to know is not all nodes are going to have the exact same kind of properties and parameters. So for example, if we were to bring in a blur, you'll notice that this one actually only has an intensity. So if we were to bring in, say, another different node, and we're just going to bring in something like a shape, some nodes have super complex and have a lot more different stuff to play with. And this is kind of one of the learning curves with Substance Designer, is having to kind of go through each node and having to learn the different parameters that each one has and kind of learning what each one can do. So here we can mess with the scale, mess with the size. We can plug this into the blur that we just dropped in earlier. And now we can start messing with the intensity. So now you can kind of see how powerful Substance Designer is when you have all these really awesome different parameters and properties to play with. Now, the really cool thing about Substance is because we have this connected, we can actually single click back onto our shape node, start messing with some few different properties, and you'll notice because it is connected to the blur, we're actually getting a live update of the blur and the kind of tweaks we're doing inside of the shape node. This only works if you do a single click. If you were to do a double click, you'll notice that the 2D view just brings up exactly what is in the node preview. So again, we can kind of keep doing some more different adjustments. So if I were to do a levels from here, plug in this blur, mess with the levels to this node, so we get like kind of a sharper, and we start getting some nice curves on the shape. Because we double clicked on this level as our last kind of node, we do a single click to the shape, and we start messing with the parameters here. We'll get some different results, and we start seeing the changes throughout the entire graph. So not only do you have the ability to change characteristics and parameters for each individual node, we can also change parameters for the graph as a whole. To do that, we just double click anywhere empty inside the graph view, and you'll notice that the parameters window changes to the name of the actual project you have open in the Explorer window. From here, we have a few different options. We have the brace parameters, the attributes, the outputs, inputs, input parameters. One really cool feature about Substance Designer is the ability to change the dimensions of your texture at any given point. So Substance Designer works in two different ways. We have relative to parent and absolute. You can kind of see the definition of each by going into the file, new substance, and you're actually able to choose a different size mode. So we have relative to parent or absolute. Relative to parent actually is driven by the host, which is the graph size in general. And absolute kind of disregards the parent size altogether. So I kind of want to go over those a little bit. So right now, the current project that we have open is actually relative to parent. All the nodes you see here are 512 by 512. Now you might be wondering, how do you change the size of this graph? You actually go up to the graph and just follow it all the way to the right, and you'll notice this kind of icon right here with the parent size. This is where you actually change the dimensions of your graph. This is what I usually use a lot of the time to change the dimensions of my graph. If we go back to our properties window, you'll notice that we'll have a few different parameters to play with that correspond to having the graph set to relative to parent. You'll notice that the output size is actually the parent times 1. We could actually take and double the parent size or half it as well. So because our parent size that we set is 256, we could easily bump this up to times it by 2, and we'll actually have a resolution of 512. Let's just bring this back down to parent times 1, and we'll talk about absolute a little bit. So if we double click on a single node, we can actually change the node from relative to parent to absolute. So what absolute does, as we saw in the description, it completely disregards the parent size. So we can actually change this node to be maybe like a 128 by 128. And if we go back into our parent properties and start changing start doubling the parent size, you'll notice that this stays at the 128 that we originally chose for it, because we've changed the size of the node to a fixed resolution that doesn't have to take into account the parent size. Me personally, I don't like using absolute because then it gets kind of troublesome when you want to change the resolution of your entire graph and you've actually changed some nodes to a fixed resolution. You'll start getting some really wonky effects because different nodes have different resolutions and they interact and change differently with each other. A really quick example of this is, you'll notice that this shape and this blur are both 32 and they're plugged into a 1024 levels. And you'll notice the kind of result that we get with that. Now, if we take those exact same nodes but kept them all at the 1024 dimension, you'll notice that we have a completely different result. It might be super minuscule in this example, but if we're doing really, really complex shapes and insane kind of parameters and tweaks, you'll start seeing the effects, and it could essentially break your texture at one point. So one parameter that I like to use a lot in with individual nodes is the tiling mode. So by default, everything you make inside Substance Designer is tileable, and that can be illustrated by, if we drop in a transform 2D node, we plug in this shape, and we start moving it, you'll notice that it comes in from the left. And if we move it down here to the corner, you'll notice that both corners are coming in, and it's essentially tiling. So if we wanted to break this and just have this piece here and not have these other pieces show up, we can do that by actually double clicking on the node that you want to change the tiling mode to. We go under tiling mode and we change it to absolute. Once it's changed to absolute, you'll notice that this is no longer grayed out. And right here, you can actually see H and V tiling. So we have a couple options. We can do vertical tiling, which it'll only do the up and down. We can do horizontal, it'll only do left and right. And if we do no tiling, it'll only just keep this single shape. This comes in handy when you want to create certain patterns and different intricate shapes that you don't necessarily want to tile, that you can kind of freely move on your texture. So for example, if we deleted this transform, bring in another transform, fresh a new one, we just change the tileability of this. So let's just bring it down to here. Now, say we really like this, it's tiling, but say we want to be able to fully control kind of where we put this kind of pattern. We can actually add another transform 2D, plug it in. And if we start resizing it, you'll notice that, again, it's just completely tiling. So we can actually go into the tiling mode. We can do absolute. We can turn off the no tiling. And now we can freely move this pattern wherever we want on our texture sheet. Another really useful parameter when messing with nodes is the random seed. What the random seed does is it gives you different kind of parameters and different looks to the same node. For example, this is super useful when you're creating grunge masks. So if we do bring in a grunge, you'll notice this has a certain look to it. Now, if we change the random seed, you'll notice that it instantly starts changing. This is super useful when you want to use kind of the same grunge, but you don't want it to look necessarily the same. You can actually just mess with the random seed and it'll give you different results every time. A few other nodes that work really well with the random seed are some of the patterns that you see inside of the library view, but you can also type in, for example, tile generator, or sorry, tile random. And again, we can actually just start messing with the random seed and we'll start getting different results. This is really nice if you don't want to mess with all these different parameters and just kind of get different results. But at the same time, if we were to kind of play with these and start messing with the random seed, we'll again get different results based on kind of the stuff that we're changing throughout this properties window. The last thing I want to go over with in the properties window are the attributes that are associated with the graph itself. So again, if we double click inside of an empty area inside the graph view, we'll be able to see the attributes drop down. So here, this is where we can actually name the graph, we can name the package, we can give a brief description, category, label, author, URL, and tags. This kind of information is really useful in a few certain ways. So you'll actually be able to see the name of this graph when you bring it into Painter. But if you're also adding this kind of package and saving it on the library, this is where you kind of give it an icon, you give it a tag so you'll be able to quickly search for it. So for example, if we like bring out one of these different generators that's already inside the library, we can actually go into its attribute settings for this brick, and you'll notice that it has the tags pattern, has the author algorithmic. So if we were to quickly type in pattern, you'll notice that bricks come up and all these other ones that I'm assuming have the also the same tag as pattern. So later on, when we start talking about the library view a little bit, I'll go over how these categories and these different tags can help you kind of search for stuff and categorize things inside the library window. So for now, that's all I have to go over in the properties window. We'll see you in the next one.